Oh, I think we're good.
Everybody, well, it's morning if you're over where we are in London and in Spain. My apologies for the slightly delayed start. I was having trouble connecting the Zoom account to Facebook, but we're here now. So Tom, huge thanks for waiting. Today I've got Tom Leibovitz with me from the International Workers Industrial Workers of the World, and you're part of the TEFL Workers Union. Okay, so
Exactly.
first of all, thank you so much for coming along to join us and to chat about workers' rights. Obviously, the TEFL Workers Union is a UK-based organisation, but hopefully a lot of the information that we'll be sharing today will be useful, relevant for our members around the world. So first of all, Tom, let's start with the big question. What is a union really, and who can join?
So, excuse me, sorry. I think there's two different ways to think about a union. So the first way is that it's a legal entity. So it has, as an organization, kind of like certain rights that it's given in law, and that can be to represent workers individually, or it can be to represent workers collectively through kind of collective bargaining. And that's a kind of more legalistic understanding of what a union is. And then I think there's a more practical understanding of what a union is, which is that a group of workers who band together because they want to make their life at work better. So I think we approach it in both ways. We're happy to kind of go with a more legalistic approach. At the same time, we will sometimes support a group of workers at a school who want to submit a petition to their employer on anything, some policy or a pay raise or whatever it might be. And as far as we're concerned, that is them acting as a union, even if they're not calling themselves a union, even if we're not going through like a legal kind of representation process. And then I know we have a list of questions to get through. I was just going to quickly mention one or two things before we get started, if that's all right, Teresa. So the first thing to say here is that I am not a lawyer. So like nothing that I'm offering today should be considered like capital L, capital A legal advice. So if you do have a problem at work, it is important to go ahead and like speak to your union, who will be able to give you like more targeted legal, like actual legal advice. And I'd say the other thing just to keep in mind for this entire conversation is that kind of knowing your rights and enforcing your rights are two different things. So it's really important to know your rights. That's kind of the starting point. But I think when it becomes very useful to have a union is when you want to raise some issues in the workplace. If you don't think that your rights are being respected, or you want something that goes above and beyond your basic kind of statutory rights. So yeah, absolutely, the union is here to make sure that you know your rights, but I think more importantly, the union is here to make sure that you can enforce your rights. So over to you, Teresa.
And so in terms of unions, people can be part of kind of a big trade union, a big workers union, or there are smaller unions like specifically for TEFL workers, for brewers, I think was another one that I saw linked through the channels. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so the IWW is like a big general union. In fact, one of the slogans of the IWW is the one big union. It has a very interesting history if anybody listening is a history buff. But the TEFL Workers Union is a campaign of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World.
Okay. And can anyone join a union? I mean, you talk about workers. Does that include freelancers, people who perhaps are owners of a franchise or owners of their own school?
So different unions are going to have different rules. The rule in the IWW, and it's been like this since 1905, is that no one who has the power to hire and fire or discipline workers can be a member of the union. So in most instances, this means that senior teachers are eligible for membership. DOSs are not. We love a supportive DOS, but once you step up into that level of a management role, you're not eligible for membership. ADOSs, we often have to kind of tend to talk about your role, because in one school, an ADOS might be a supervisory position, that's fine. In another school, it might be a management position, in which case we kind of have to talk a little bit about, the kind of power that you have within the workplace hierarchy. I think another thing that we kind of pride ourselves on as a union is we don't call ourselves the TEFL Teachers Union. We call ourselves the TEFL Workers Union. And that is a very conscious choice. So you can be teacher, you can be admin, sales staff, you can be a cleaner. If you work in an English language school and you're not in a managerial position, you are invited to join the union, and we've kind of got your back. Now, I do think there are some interesting things to say about what it means to be self-employed. So if you are kind of genuinely self-employed, if you're like running courses online, you've got your own websites and students contact you, and you're kind of running your own business, you could join the union, but there's probably not much that we can offer you. However, we have a lot of members who are listed as self-employed on paper, but are not actually self-employed in practice. So we have literally every time that someone's come to us and they're part of like a physical brick and mortar school and their contract says I'm self-employed, we look at the contract and we say, in practice, you are not self-employed. You're losing out on annual leave contributions. You're losing out on workplace rights, things like access to the disciplinary and grievance procedure, and you lose kind of workplace protections that come along with things like being made redundant. So there's a lot of bogus self-employment in the industry, and that has kind of been a focus of us as a union. And we've yet to lose a single dispute when someone who comes to us from a physical brick and mortar school is self-employed. We always win them a whole bunch of money and then get them reclassified as an employee with extra rights. And the final thing I'll say, and then I'll stop rambling, is these kind of online platforms where people are sometimes listed as self-employed is much more of a gray area. It's kind of that Uberification of English language teaching, and there is definitely scope for legal challenge whether people who work for these big online teaching platforms are legitimately self-employed. But it is a bit more of a gray area. It needs a kind of quite a big legal challenge to kind of set a precedent and to kind of work out the contours of what's genuine self-employment within an online teaching platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I suppose that kind of false self-employment is probably a problem everywhere, but I know it's a big issue in the UK with 0-hour contracts and things like that. And I mean, the TEFL Workers Union has gone up against some of the big schools as well. I saw on your Twitter feed today you're in talks with the British Council about various disputes.
Yeah, we can talk a lot about that if you're interested. That's our big dispute at the moment. So the British Council, for their online teachers, they employ them through an outsourced agency called Impellum. And it's a very clear strategy. If you directly employ someone, you have certain responsibilities towards them, and they can kind of hold you accountable legally. Once you employ someone through an agency, they lose a whole host of rights that comes with direct employment. And one of the big ones that they lose is in America, what we call at-will employment. So your employer can just basically tell you, today, I don't want you don't bother coming in tomorrow. If you're directly employed, if they want to dismiss you, you have to go through a capability or a disciplinary process. If you're an agency worker, you don't. You're at the whim of the employer. And the way it works at the British Council for their online teachers is they release all the available hours in just like a big chunk. And then everybody jumps onto the website and tries to secure enough hours to kind of get them, to pay their bills. And the workers kind of refer to this as like a feeding frenzy. And because you had workers from a variety of different time zones who were trying to get these same hours, and people didn't know when the hours would get released, you had people who'd sit by their computers all day, or people who were waking up in the middle of the night just in hopes of getting some hours. And one of our members there raised this as an issue and said basically, like, this is not good for my mental health. It's not good for the mental health of my colleagues. People can't sleep. They're having stress and anxiety. And after raising these concerns, she was dismissed. So as a union, we take the position that what she did in raising these issues was whistleblowing. It's known legally as a protected disclosure. And that by dismissing her, she's facing detriment as a whistleblower, which is illegal. So we have a legal case that is kind of proceeding, but we're also fighting this one out on the streets. So on Tuesday, we had 4 different protests across the UK and Ireland. I think as we're finishing up our chat today, there will be another protest happening in Edinburgh. with further international protests planned. So yeah, we take these matters extremely seriously, and they're all tied up into how employers try to keep teachers at arm's length, because it means that the teachers then have less rights. But as a union, we're not going to stand for that. So yes, if people want to check out our website or our social media, there's lots of fun pictures. And if you want to get involved, whether you're in the UK or internationally, it's a big campaign and there's lots of scope for people to get stuck in. If they're interested, send us an email at tefl@iww.org.uk.
Yes, very good. And you've been doing kind of Twitter storms and things like that.
Yeah. So again, this is where Twitter Storm, for people who might not know, is we pick 24 hours and we have kind of like a template tweet or like a series of template tweets raising an issue for a worker or a group of workers with a particular employer. And we might target the employer directly, or we might target some of the employer's kind of business partners, just to make them aware that there's a dispute or that maybe they don't have the best employment practices. And it's often kind of an early stage action that we take. And it's just kind of putting the employer on notice that, like, hey, you might think that this is going to be a little quiet thing, and maybe our lawyers talk to your lawyers, but no. If you're not treating our members with respect, we're going to kind of make sure the world knows about that. So it tends to be a bit of a shot across the bow for bad employers, just to let them know that we're here to hold them to account.
Very good. So we've kind of talked about some of the benefits of joining a union and, having your contract looked at and learning more about your rights and having someone to have your back if you have an issue. Are there any drawbacks? From American TV series, you always see that. Don't let them start a union.
Well, we can talk about, being American, I have all sorts of stories about the kind of anti-union propaganda you get when you start jobs in the States. However, look, the employers don't like unions, and there's a reason that employers don't like unions, because it means as a worker, you're going to have better paying conditions, you're going to have a voice on the job, management's going to have more limited power in the workplace, which is not what they want, but that's obviously what's good for us, because it means that we have better lives at work. So I always think, like, if an employer likes your union's not doing their job right. Which is not to say that the IWW is unhappy having a positive relationship with employers, but there's an inherent conflict that happens in the workplace where employers want to save money, but as workers, we want higher pay, better conditions. We want to work less hours, which costs the employer money. So that's kind of a long way of saying that your employer might not be happy that you've joined a union. And while in law, in just about every country in the world, you can't be sacked for being a member of a union, in practice, it happens. So our advice to our members is you announce your union membership either when you need individual representation in something like a disciplinary or a grievance. And if we don't know what those terms means, I'm happy to explain them. Or you kind of go public as a group with your workmates saying, oh, hey, we're all a member of this union. So then you've got that kind of like safety and strength in numbers, so they can't pick off any one person as a bit of a troublemaker. And I think, like, our union, our union is a little bit different than maybe some of the big unions that people might be familiar with. So one of the big differences that we have is that we have no paid officers or officials or organizers. Everybody who's active in the union is doing it as a volunteer. So on one level, that means we don't have like a big bureaucracy that has their own interest. On the other hand, it means that you're not going to have some highly paid official kind of swoop in to solve your problems. So in the IWW, it is important that you get involved in the union, because kind of what you put into the union is also kind of what you get out of it. And you'll get a ton of support. We have very dedicated people, but all volunteers. So, like, to some extent, we are a kind of DIY union. And that does mean that, like, people kind of need to get involved to make the union work. So, and then the final thing I'll say is that, and this kind of gets away from the drawbacks, but to the benefits of a union, someone once told me when I was much younger, that joining a union means that you're never alone when you have a problem at work. And I think when you think of it like that, like, working in TEFL is great in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of like wonderful things about the job, but I think we all know that it's not perfect. And I think kind of that idea that when you have a problem at work, you're never going to be alone, I think is quite kind of powerful. So I'd say it's worth your 10 or 12 pounds a month that you pay to be a union membership, just to know that you're never alone when you have a problem at work.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that we obviously TEFL Workers Union is more UK based. How could people find out about other unions in their area?
Sure. So there is an organization that was started by one of our members before he was one of our members, which is the Teachers at Work Special Interest Group, TOSIG. Bit of interesting history there. He tried to start it through kind of IATEFL properly. And IATEFL made it very clear to him that that's not what IATEFL is here for. And they did not want to look at matters of employment law or working conditions as part of IATEFL as an organization. Anyway, so he started this Teachers as Workers Special Interest Group, and there's a website, and he's tried to compile basically like workers' rights, kind of broad like employment legislation and regulations in the main countries where TEFL work happens. So you can always pop over to TOSIG, and they'll give you a broad overview, and there might be some links to unions that operate in those countries. For us as a union, the IWW is an international union, Industrial Workers of the World. So we do have branches in various countries around the world, and then we also tend to have good relationships with other unions, whether they're unions that like we historically have a relationship with as the IWW, or other English language teaching unions around the world. So for example, in Spain, where you're based, there's a union called the CNT. And we've called on the CNT when we've had disputes with employers that have locations in Spain. And we've had kind of like the CNT has organized protests on our behalf outside language schools or outside conferences in Spain as well, to target UK-based employers who are not treating their staff properly. And we've done the same thing for other unions that they have a dispute and the company has a location here in the UK. We will offer some solidarity. So you can always email the union, and we will do our best to put you in contact with someone, a union near you that can offer you support. And if you just want general organizing advice, how to raise an issue with your employer, we will give that advice to anyone. Though that's a pretty simple process. It doesn't really matter what country you're based in, because it's just how to speak to your workmates and how to raise issues with management. It's once you get to the legal side of things that you want to make sure that you're in contact with a union in your locality.
So what would you recommend someone does if they're having an issue at work? Is it a good idea to go directly to the union? Should there be a process that people follow?
Yeah. So I think the first bit of advice is don't suffer in silence. I think there's often a feeling when you have a problem at work that it's individual. It's just you who is facing this problem. And look, it's not to say that that's not the case, but problems are rarely individual. Even a boss who's a bully, or even a boss who's like a sexual harasser, which is something we've dealt with, it's very rarely that it's just targeted against a single individual. It's often part of a pattern of behavior. So I think first, like, don't suffer in silence, speak to a trusted workmate or come speak to the union. And then if it turns out that there are other people who are affected by this problem, then raising it collectively is going to be important for moral support, but it's also going to be important that you can't kind of get picked off as an individual. Obviously, the more people who are involved, the more power and the more strength that you have. And I'd also say, don't quit. And I would never hold it against someone who's like hating their job and it's bad for their mental health. And they say, look, I just have to get out of this job. But I would caution against an idea that quitting is how we change the industry, because we'll get people who contact us and like, oh, I've quit this job and now I want to like get back at my employer effectively. And you have a lot more leverage and a lot more power while you're currently employed. There's a lot more ways to hold the employer to account, and hopefully change kind of the internal culture of the organization that led to the problem in the first place. And I also think there's sometimes an idea that like, I'll show them I'm a good teacher, I care about my students, I'll quit, and then they'll see what they're missing. And I don't think that's what employers take away from that. What employers take away from that is that we can treat people badly and they just quit if they don't like it. Sticking around and holding them to account is a much more powerful step to take. So see if you can find a workmate to support you. And I think it's important to have a workmate to support you, because if you want to attend any meetings with your manager to discuss your problem at work, bringing along a workmate is, again, important for your own moral support, but also sends a bit of a message to your manager that, look, this isn't just me. I've got at least one workmate who's got my back. And it makes it more likely that the employer is going to act with maybe more discretion in how they deal with you when you raise issues at work. So yeah, once you found the workmate who can support you, or attempted to, then contact the union. And the union is here to kind of guide you through raising a workplace issue. The general advice is to raise it informally first. So that can just be a nice, polite email to your manager, just saying, look, this is the issue that I'd have. I'd like to have a meeting to discuss it with you. I'd like to bring along my workmate. These meetings can be a little bit emotionally difficult for me, and having someone there with me helps me collect my thoughts, so like you find a way to bring a workmate along with you. And if it is a collective issue, thinking about raising it collectively. So not saying, oh, just I'd like a meeting with you, but actually we'd like a staff meeting to discuss this issue, and then make sure that all you and your workmates are kind of on the same page for how to go ahead and raise this issue kind of as a group. If you are unsuccessful kind of with an informal approach, at least in the UK and probably in most countries where people today are listening from, there's going to be some sort of a grievance process. So I think most people are familiar with the disciplinary process. Disciplinary is your employer has said, we think that you're doing something wrong, we're going to have a meeting, there might be a sanction. A grievance is that in reverse. So it's you going to your employer and saying, I think you're not following the contract, you've broken the law, you're not following your own policies. I'd like a meeting. I can bring a union rep with me. The union rep comes in, we can handle the legal side of things, you handle the emotional side of things, and then the employer is responsible for like responding in writing with any actions that they're going to take to rectify the issue that you've raised. But that's a much more formal, legalistic process, and we tend to say, and the law tends to say, you raise it informally first. If you can't resolve it informally, then you move to that legal step of a grievance. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to be thinking about external legal options. So that could be an employment tribunal or some sort of labor court, or it could be that this is actually a matter of like campaigning or organizing. So the law often just sets a floor on what our kind of rights are, but we want to go above and beyond what we're legally entitled. So it could be that that's when we start moving on to those things like Twitter storms or social media, other social media actions, or thinking about things like, organizing industrial action, up to and including going on strike. Because like ultimately, you want to show the employer that you have some power in the workplace, and it's by demonstrating power that you can kind of end up resolving some of these smaller issues, because the employer realizes that this can be escalated if needed. And it's in their interest to kind of resolve things in the early steps so they don't kind of, become larger issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned kind of doing things by email originally. I mean, obviously that gives you a good paper trail of any discussions, anything that happens. Can you request to record a meeting as well? Like if you are on your own, for example?
So there's going to be different laws in different countries. In the UK, both parties have to assent to a meeting being recorded. If you were to record it on your own, for example, you would not be able to submit that into evidence in an employment tribunal if you hadn't received the employer's permission to do so. That said, this question comes up a lot, and I think the reason it comes up is because there's a feeling that like if I've got my employer's voice saying something, then it's a bit of like you've caught them red-handed maybe. But employment tribunals, they accept contemporaneous evidence. Like if you have a meeting with your employer and then you leave and you take notes and you say, I said this, he said this, they said this is what was discussed. And then it goes to an employment tribunal, and you go to the judge and you say, look, I had this meeting 6 months ago, and immediately after the meeting, these are the notes that I took. They will accept those notes in good faith. So an employment judge is going to say notes that you take are just as good as recording a meeting. So again, I'd say it's probably not the thing to get too hung up on. What's more important is just to generally be taking notes in the workplace. So if you've got an employer who you think is maybe bullying, or there's discrimination happening, or you have a meeting with your employer and you think you've been disciplined without actually going through a formal disciplinary process, take notes, save those notes, contact the union. The notes are just as good as an actual recording.
Yeah, and I suppose as well that kind of evidence of what has happened. Yeah, so yeah, if you're in any doubt, make notes of what happened, when, where, who was there, etc., as a good starting point. You mentioned discrimination, and I know that this is kind of a hot topic for a lot of our members, a lot of our listeners here. So around native speakerism, particularly within the European Union, it's illegal to advertise for positions based on first language. What can people do anything if they feel they've been discriminated against, but it's not obvious? It's not kind of, we can't take you because you're not native speaker. If they have a feeling, is there anything they can do?
So in preparation for this question, I hope the people at home don't mind that we did some prep for the questions beforehand. I've taken a decent amount of notes here. So Teresa, please interrupt me if you need to clarify anything. Okay, so the first thing to say is that like native speakerism has been kind of a key concern of our union from our inception. One of our earliest disputes, this would have been before the pandemic. So what would that have been, 2018? Wow, okay. There was a school here in London where there was a woman who was basically being bullied because she wore a headscarf. She was being told that she couldn't teach in the classrooms that were facing the street because management didn't want passersby seeing that they had a teacher kind of wearing a headscarf. And I think it's one of these interesting ones where I think she actually was a native speaker. I think she was born in London, but the perception and how tightly native speakerism and just straight up racism are intertwined. And anyway, what happened is we had one of our members there, one of the founding members of the union, actually kind of rallied his workmates together, and they all wrote a letter to management basically saying, we're really unhappy with the way that this person is being treated. And we just, this needs to change. And in the end, the woman ended up quitting. She couldn't take it, which again, don't hold it against her. It's an awful thing. And then later in that same school, they didn't learn their lesson. They did it again. And that time, the woman that they were discriminated against took it to an employment tribunal and ended up winning like £5,000 as a result of being discriminated against. So as a union, this is literally from the word go been an issue that we've been concerned with. That said, these issues are easier to deal with within the UK or within the European Union because you have laws that allow you to challenge this. Let me step back. Native speakerism and discrimination is an interesting one because in most instances in the UK, you don't have access to an employment tribunal until you have 2 years of employment. So most UK rights are not legally enforceable until 2 years of employment. There are exceptions to this, and one of these exceptions is discrimination. And native speakerism is an example of discrimination. And interestingly, it's not even like a day one right. It doesn't begin on the day of your employment. It can begin from even like a job advert. So it's like a pre-day one right. So if there is a job advert that is discriminatory, you could potentially, if you can show detriment, again, the law gets a bit complicated, but if you can show detriment, then you could take an employer to an employment tribunal just on the grounds of the job advert itself. So there is pretty good legal recourse in the UK and across the European Union in matters like this. However, where it gets complicated is that a lot of the issues of native speakerism happen in these kind of online platforms that are based outside of the UK. So we've had campaigns, it was a while ago now, but a woman who was just told the students don't like you because you have an accent, therefore we're pulling you off our platform. And this school, I think, was based in China. Was it Wales English? I think it was called Wales English. And anyway, all we could do, we had a social media campaign. We attempted to kind of name and shame them, but we had no legal recourse, right? Because this was an employer that was based in China. We couldn't kind of move towards like physical protest because they didn't have any locations here in the UK. So it's that problem where online teaching, again, that Uberification of English language teaching that we've talked about, it's a bit of a Wild West, and it becomes very difficult to find legal or even extra legal mechanisms to hold these big online teaching platforms to account. So as a union, we tend to think this is actually a wider issue of regulation. The TEFL industry in particular is not very well regulated. The closest thing we have to regulation is the British Council, and we know what a terrible employer they are. And so we tend to think that, like, look, the government needs to step in and needs to regulate TEFL as a whole, but certainly needs to regulate these online platforms. But that's not going to happen unless we can build up kind of a critical mass of people demanding that change. So I would say if you are working for one of these online platforms, it is worth getting a hold of us as a union, or maybe getting a hold of a union in your location to say, like, look, how can we kind of build towards a movement that demands regulation of this sector as a whole, and then looking at native speakerism as one of kind of the key issues that these big online platforms, I mean, they're operating within the European Union or within the UK unlawfully, right? Because they are actively engaging in native speakerism, but we have no, because the government is not regulating them, we have no mechanism to step in and kind of challenge that. So it's one of those kind of like larger issues that, like, join the union. Don't just join the union because like you might have a problem today. Join the union because the union is here to push for like wider change across the industry that makes the industry more fair and takes on these kind of bad employers through kind of wider government regulation. The final thing I will say on this is that there's a lot that big players in the industry could do. So I worked at EF, and here in the UK, when I worked at EF, half the teachers were non-native speakers. They're great here in the UK. There's a lot of problems with the EF, but here in the UK, hiring non-native speakers is not one of the issues. However, there are schools in China or there are schools in other countries. They say, we will only accept teachers who speak English or from one of the 7 predominantly white English-speaking countries. And if you push EF on that, they say, well, look, it's about visa requirements. We can't give someone a visa as an English teacher if they don't come from one of these countries. And they're not wrong, like they're not lying about that. However, they're not doing anything to change that. So if you take a look at, people at home might be familiar with English UK, which is the trade body of English language schools here in the UK. They have, they have some political clout. And while they might kind of pay lip service to things like native speakerism, they're not using their political clout to like push for a change in visa requirements in China or Vietnam or wherever kind of like native speakerism is enforced at a state level. They use the political clout that they have to like push for reduction in business rates. So it's one of those things where like the rhetoric of the industry doesn't always live up to the practical, how the industry practically operates. And I think that if big TEFL players like English UK, like the British Council, like TEFL were serious about this kind of thing, they wouldn't just like talk about it. They'd actually undertake actions to try and change the culture of the industry. And the reality is that they're just not doing that. Does that cover it all, Teresa?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, because definitely that the visa requirements argument comes up quite a lot. And you're absolutely right that there are big international companies who could be pushing for the government to change their visa requirements within the ELT sector, because certainly like British Council, International House, they have schools around the globe, and in those predominantly Asian countries that have these visa requirements, they could do a lot, and they should do a lot.
Yep. Absolutely.
Excellent. I don't think I've got any more questions. We've had a few people watching, but nobody's added any questions. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention? I mean, I'll share the links for how people can join and the
Sure.
Facebook page as well, and the Twitter.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I guess, is there anything else kind of worth mentioning? I guess, what else did I want to say? Um, I guess, what I want to say is that I'm going to go back to that point that there's a lot of really, really nice things about English language teaching. But as someone who's been teaching English at this point for 12 or 13 years, maybe 14 years at this point, goodness, I think it's interesting that quite often people don't stick around in the industry once they want to have kids or once they want to have a mortgage. And I think that's quite an indictment of the industry. And I think that one of the kind of slogans that we have as a union is like hashtag make TEFL a career. And I think that reflects the fact that for a lot of people, it just can't be a career. You might love TEFL. And I have friends that I've made in TEFL that I'm still friends with that left years ago because they said, look, I wanted to have a kid. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have a mortgage. Like I want to have a pension. And TEFL doesn't allow that. And I think basically we have to find a way to hold schools to account, and TEFL will only become a long-term career option for a lot of people once teachers have a voice on the job. So one of the things that we became most active as a union was during the redundancy crisis during COVID. So here in the UK, about 50% of teachers were made redundant over COVID. And we put together a redundancy rights kind of training, and we trained up hundreds of teachers and kind of helped them through the redundancy process. And we did this because A, we want to support people, but B, we kind of wanted to show people that, like, look, the union is here. When you have a problem at work, the union can support you. And it was with an idea that the people who do stick around in the industry after kind of COVID, they would come to us when they had a problem at work. And to some extent, that has kind of borne fruit as a strategy. Prior to COVID, I might get contacted by like a lone individual who said, like, I have this problem at work, what can I do? And we say, well, look, we'll do our best to support you. But as one person, your options are quite limited. Now it's much more likely that someone says, I've been speaking to my workmates, we've got this problem at work. Someone asked me to contact the union. How can the union help us? And it's like, oh, well, if you're contacting me on behalf of 4 or 5 or 25 people, we have a lot more options than we had previously. So I guess kind of the main message that I have for people is like, talk to each other about problems at work. Think about how you can raise those problems collectively, and then come to our union or come to a union in your country and say, this is the problem that we've had. This is where we're at. How can we support you? And it's only by tackling those problems collectively that we're really going to be able to see kind of a culture shift in the industry. And that's fundamentally, as a union, what we want to achieve.
I mean, we've had just when you were chatting then, Alex Popovsky's added a comment here as well about, the fact that TEFL is not regulated, that, you can speak up locally perhaps about issues in your area, but the problem is that at an international level, she says laws and regulations are different, but we need to keep talking about our rights and raising awareness.
Yep.
And I mean, I mentioned to you before kind of the TESOL Spain conference was coming up, and that you could perhaps come and do something there. Do the TEFL Workers Union, do they have a presence at conferences and places where they might reach out to workers?
Yeah, we get invited to them. Part of it is just an issue of just the amount of I'm always trying to find a more gender neutral term for manpower. Just general, like, just capacity. There you go. Often it's just kind of, it's an issue of capacity, because we are like an all volunteer union. We need people to volunteer to go and do those sorts of things. But yeah, we often get invited to go to those things. Sometimes we'll set up a little stall outside, like I think there's something fun about like being at the factory gates and talking to people on the way in, like, and then occasionally we get invited to like people, maybe they're teaching a master's in TESOL, like we get invited by the lecturers to come and speak to the classes just to kind of talk a little bit about the industry, and kind of like the legal landscape, as well as like kind of what we've talked about today, what to do if you have a problem at work. So yeah, but again, it's one of those things where the industry doesn't like us, and that's fine. And again, like in a sense, the industry shouldn't like us, because the industry for so long, and the industry about here, I mean like the companies, the publishers, management doesn't like us, because for so long they've operated just without any sort of check on their power. And when people, I've mentioned this already, but when people went to TEFL and said, look, we want to create a special interest group specifically looking at teachers' working conditions, TEFL made it abundantly clear that this was not what TEFL was in the business to do. So the kind of, because we want to change the culture, because we want to change the balance of power, the institutional interests within TEFL are not the ones who are reaching out to us and asking us to come to conferences. So, but yeah, you might see us outside with a stall causing some trouble.
Alex has just added that she did plenary talks on teachers' workers' rights at several conferences, and the reactions were amazing. I think teachers want this information, but like you say, they're perhaps not going to get it from their employer. They're not going to find it easily available unless they start looking as well.
Well, Alex, if you want to shoot us an email, and if you wanted to like maybe write a condensed version of some of your talks to stick on our website, that would be great. I don't know if you're based in the UK. If you are, we have an employment rights section of our website as well. And if you had any kind of specialty knowledge, we'd be more than happy to have you write up some guidance for us. Oh, what's his name? Oh, goodness. He's friends with our union. I should know his name. Someone just did an amazing talk it was actually at an TEFL conference, which was entitled Time to Problematize Capitalism in ELT, question mark. Oh, goodness. What's his name? He wrote a whole series for us. I feel terrible. Anyway, there have been, not Hugh, although Hugh is a good friend of ours. We love Hugh and Hugh loves us. But there are interesting things that you can somewhat sneak under the radar at these conferences, but us as an organization, because we pick fights with the British Council and we pick fights with English UK, the same people that organize these conferences are the same people who we've picked fights with. They don't tend to be very interested in having us there as an organization.
Well, you should definitely get in touch with Alex, because she is the current TEFL president. So she is definitely kind of keen on promoting things for workers' rights. Yeah.
Well, Alex, I would love to see TEFL take a change of tact in regards to how they deal with people pushing for workers' rights within the industry, because it's maybe worth, the guy who set up TOSIG, his name is Blair. It might be worth you having a chat with him, because I think it's fair to say he left with a very bad taste in his mouth in regards to how TEFL dealt with the time and energy he was willing to put into kind of bringing workers' rights onto the agenda. But we can all hopefully kind of move past that and find some positive ways to work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it as well. It's about building those connections, building that community, like you say, so that people don't feel that they're fighting the fight alone, whether it's, alone as a union or alone as collectively the whole body of teachers and workers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if anybody has any other questions for Tom, do feel free to pop them in the comments. The TEFL Workers Union isn't a member of the group, but I can certainly feed them over to Tom via email, and I'll also share the Facebook group and the Twitter link so that you can get in touch with them that way, and the website where they've got the email address as well. So Tom, thanks so much for coming along today. It was a really interesting chat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep, and yeah, hopefully we can get some more people involved in the TEFL Workers Union.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks to everybody at home for joining us.
Have a great day, everyone.